Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Dan Olsen. So I'm excited to talk about MVP. I've not given a talk, I've shared some advice here and there in other talks about MVP, but I've never given a talk just solely focused on MVP. And, my book obviously has some ideas in MVP. I have a lot of new content since the book came out in 2015 from my consulting and workshops that I do for private companies, particularly enterprise B2B companies where this can be a big challenge. But MVP, in the product world, we have terms like pivot, Scrum, Agile, MVP, prototype, roadmap, and backlog. And some of those words, there's more of a general consensus among people what it means, but some of them, there are differences of opinions and often debates. And I would argue that MVP is probably the most highly debated term in the product world out of all the terms. You have people arguing like, that is an MVP. No, that's not an MVP, So I want to try to the purpose of this talk is to try to provide some clarity so we can try to kind of get aligned on what an MVP is and how you should be thinking about it and how you can use it. That's the idea. And you see, I grabbed these Russian dolls. The reason I did that is because they're different sizes, right? They fit inside each other. So there's smaller ones and there's bigger ones. And that's kind of the trick with an MVP. At the end of the day, an MVP is about picking the right scope. It's about picking the right size. So, try not to pick the biggest doll, right? That's not MVP. Try to see the smallest doll that you can pick. We'll talk more about this, but basically what's the smallest doll we can get away with basically, right? And to test our ideas. That's the idea. So that's, if you're wondering why I have this funky picture, that's why I have the picture of the dolls there. Real quick, for those of you that aren't familiar with my background, I started out with a technical background. My parents got me a computer when I was a kid. I'm very glad they did because I was comfortable with coding. I was an electrical engineering major. My first job out of college was submarine design. It was very technical. I didn't realize at the time, in hindsight, it was very similar to technical product management. After doing that, I wanted to get more on the business side of things. I moved out here to Silicon Valley to go to a business school at Stanford. And while I was at business school at Stanford, trying to figure out what I wanted to do after graduation, I learned about this exciting new career called product management back then. And the more I learned about it, the more I got excited and it sounded like a great fit. But I had never done it before. So I asked everybody, hey, where's the best place to learn product management? And at the time, most people pretty much said Intuit. And so I was very fortunate to get a job at Intuit. I worked at Intuit for a while and it delivered on what people were saying. I learned a ton about product management, product development, marketing, market research, all that. After Intuit, I took my learning and applied it as a product leader at a few startups. I co-founded a startup as well. And I got into this, giving talks and teaching workshops. And then I got into consulting with a lot of different companies and startups. And that led to basically me writing the book, The Lean Product Playbook. And that's how I spend my time today, what we're doing today, right? Sharing best practices and advice on how to create successful products, whether it's a public event like this or a private workshop or a conference. So and I founded our group, and you can learn more about me and see all my talks and slides and things at dan-olsen.com. I work with a lot of companies. I've been doing this for a long time. So B2B, B2C, B2BC, most industry verticals, Fortune 10, all the way to the bootstrap startup. I've worked with a lot of companies. And honestly, the challenge is there's common patterns, even though people are in different industries. So and because it's always nice to get a group of product people together, we're all so busy usually. In many of my talks, I like to start out just by sharing the most important, piece of product management wisdom that there is out there. And some of you, if you're familiar with my talks, you may already know it, but it's basically the product manager's motto. And the product manager's motto, it's a little bit like Spider-Man's motto. With great power comes great responsibility, right? That's Spider-Man's motto. So the product manager's motto, it's similar. It's just a little different. It's with great responsibility comes no power, right? We're responsible for all these things, for shipping a successful product and hitting OKRs, but nobody reports to us, right? So we're on the hook for delivering results, but we've got to influence without authority and convince people to do stuff. So, and one of the things we're responsible for is hopefully recommending and determining what the MVP should be. This is the main framework from my book and my work, which is the product market fit pyramid. I developed this after working on, dozens of different products and seeing a meta pattern of what it takes to achieve product market fit. I'm not going to go into the details. There are other talks where I go into the details. I just want to kind of give a quick overview and show context where MVP lives, right? So you've got your target customer who we're trying to solve problems for. What are the needs that they have? What are their underserved needs that we can address? What's our value prop? which is basically what benefits are we going to address? How are we going to be better or different? And then it's feature set, and then UX. Feature set, this is where MVP lives, right? What is the scope of functionality that we think we need to build or pursue, right? And I want to show the other version of this pyramid that highlights which of these layers are in the problem space and which are in the solution space. And again, I'm not going to get into I have plenty of other talks about problem space, solution space. You can check out those. If you're not familiar, check it out. But my main point here is feature set is the first time you start going into solution space. And that's why MVP lives there basically, right? Like once you have the solid foundation of who's our customer, what's our underserved need, how are we going to meet that need in a way that's better than the competition, then you've got a solid foundation in problem space. Then you can start to think about features and what your MVP is. All right. So I mentioned that MVP is one of the most hotly debated terms out there, right? I remember, actually, it's funny because Heaton just gave a talk. I remember it was around 2000, 2007, 2008. Everyone was excited, like MVP, because of Lean Startup, everyone was talking about MVP, MVP, MVP. And there were a lot of blog posts about it, right? And I remember here's one blog post that got written, which was about Buffer, right? So Buffer is a tool that works with Twitter. And they basically validated their idea with a landing page. Before they built anything, they kind of like did a landing page with the promise of what the product was going to do and a plans and pricing button that people could click on, right? And so that team decided to write an article, how to successfully validate your idea with the landing page MVP, right? Sounds reasonable, right? And the tagline there is anything can be your minimum viable product so long as you're truly focused on validated learning. Now, a lot of people read this, saw this article and said, what are you talking about? There is no way a landing page could possibly be an MVP. So someone wrote a counter post with the title, a landing page is not an MVP, right? Just direct contradiction, right? These polar opposite views of, hey, anything can be an MVP versus there's no way a landing page can be an MVP, right? There's just no way. So basically, that's the crux of it. The more laid back point of view is like anything you can learn from could be an MVP, anything you can test hypothesis with. The more hardcore view is, they basically listen to that and they're these people and they go, don't you know what the P means? P means product. A landing page is not a product. So it's got to be something you deliver. It's got to be an offering. It's got to be a product, right? And then these folks are more like, hey, why you got to be so rigid, man? Anything you can learn from. As long as you're focused on validated learning, you can see it says right there, as long as you're focused, it's okay, right? So in my experience, no matter how long those perspectives talk to each other, they're never going to agree. They're just like, one is holding on to that P product. The other one is like very thinking about, hey, everything's a hypothesis, right? So what I've developed since the book is a spectrum, an MVP spectrum, from like the least hardcore to the most hardcore. And what I want you to do is think about where's your interpretation of MVP fall on the spectrum, right? There's no right answer here, right? So what I'm going to ask the question is an MVP something a customer can read about to learn about your product, like a landing page, right? That person that wrote that blog post, they'd say yes right here. They'd be like, yes, it is. Next up is we're getting higher. Is it something a customer can see what the product will look like? So, mock-ups, like some static screen mocks that we've got. So the next one up is it an MVP, something a customer can interact with, an interactive prototype they can click around and things like that. And then the next level is an MVP have to be something a customer can actually use, right? And I've got multiple levels. From my last workshop I gave, they helped me create 3 different levels of something they can use, right? I was using the term proof of concept, and they were saying, well, that means throwaway code. Like we're not actually going to use that code, but we're going to code something, but we're not going to use that code. So that's why I call it throwaway code. The next layer up is, okay, they can use it and it's not throwaway code. It's an alpha. It's rough, but it's real code. They can use it. And the next kind of can use is like, hey, it's a private beta. It's like, it's not an alpha anymore. It's a private beta now. It's a little more polished. It's still private beta, right? And then the final one is no. And I've had clients tell me, none of these are good enough for MVP, Dan. None of these are good. It's got to be something people can pay you for, that they can buy. It's got to be publicly available product that they can pay you for, right? And I've had clients that live all the way out there, right? So again, there's no right answers, but this is why different people have different opinions about it. Is different people pick different points on there, right? Somebody said, what if it's free? Well, then private, basically it's the same as a private beta or a public beta, right? I mean, you could add another dimension of can use publicly available product. That's right. I could add one more in here. Thank you. Now I have another iteration. I'm iterating too. So next time I'm going to add one, can use public product, can pay for a public product, right? With payment basically, right? So that's the idea. So it's just interesting. So, all right. So we've got this wide spectrum of what people consider to be an MVP. And, I think part of it is people are trying to use the same term MVP to cover all these things, right? Or it means something, only means like a subset to people. And what I want to do is take a step back. Like in my book and trying to solve this issue, I said, you know what? The hardcore people that are living over here, they're never going to agree that a landing page and mockups are an MVP. They're just never going to agree. So, and it's bad. I forgot to mention this. It's bad when people are inventing alternate acronyms like minimum lovable product, minimum sellable product, minimum marketable features. Like, oh, I don't like that. So now you make new stuff up. It doesn't really make things any better because now nobody knows what that is and they disagree on that, right? Now, some people, it's gotten so bad, like, oh, we can't agree. We're just going to stop using the term MVP. And I understand the motivation behind that, but it's like, I'd rather try to come up with a framework so we can try to agree. So we have some terminology that we can use, right? And so for me, I think there's like at least 3 different things going on when we talk about or think about an MVP. So I want to tease those 3 apart, 3 different interpretations. There's the MVP, which is eventually at the end of the day, it's going to end up being a live working product. Right? At the end of the process, we're going to have a live working product. No one's saying, obviously that's the goal eventually. So everyone agrees that's an MVP, right? Because it's got the P, it's got the product. Now, a lot of these other things we could classify and use a different term, call them MVP prototypes. They're not the actual live working code, but they're a representation of what the product will be, right? So mock-ups, prototypes, things like that, right? Throwaway code, that would be MVP prototype, right? So that's one way maybe to have a little alignment. Say, oh, you're talking about an MVP prototype. I'm talking about an MVP. Okay, cool. We can try to resolve this disagreement. The funny thing is the most fundamental aspect of MVP, going back to those Russian dolls, is actually neither of those things. It's, well, what's the scope of functionality that we need? Whether we're going to build it or prototype it, what needs to be in scope and what can be out of scope, right? And so this is the thinking work behind whether you then say, okay, cool, once we've agreed on that, let's go build it. My preference would be, hey, once we agree on the scope of functionality, let's go prototype it and test it, and then we'll build it after we iterate and test it, right? But either way, this is the common denominator of, you've got to be deliberate about this. You've got to be deliberate about this, whether you go to prototype it or whether you go to build it, right? And we all know best practices is, hey, you should prototype it. If there's a lot of risk, if there's significant risk involved, you should prototype it and test it before you build it. If it's just fixing a bug, then just go fix the bug. That's fine, right? So if there's low risk, you might just go straight to building it. But in general, you want to prototype it to validate your assumptions, right? So that's really what, the essence of MVP is about. And we'll talk more about that. From the book, I used the big umbrella term MVP tests. And I decided to categorize them to kind of cover all the MVP tests that are out there, right? And the most helpful way I thought to divide it was between product tests and non-product tests, which basically amount to marketing tests. So you're testing, this goes back to what JC was testing, we're testing hypotheses. Are you testing a product hypothesis? Are you testing a marketing hypothesis? And then we've got qualitative tests versus quantitative tests. Quantitative tests are, kind of numerical at scale, large sample sizes. Qualitative tests are more one-on-one, small sample sizes, basically, right? The things that live in product tests, qualitative, live product lives here, right? If you're getting feedback on your live product, which everyone would agree is an MVP, that would live here, right? This is where wireframes, mockups, and prototypes live, right? Because it's basically you're testing your product experience or user experience of your product. This is also where 2 specific MVP types live, which is Wizard of Oz and Concierge, right? And so to cover these real quick, Wizard of Oz is kind of like the movie, the wizard is behind the curtain and you can't really tell what's going on. So you're kind of like faking it till you make it. You're faking something that you know won't scale. So you might do a manual process, right? So in the early days of Zappos, the successful online shoe company, you know, the founder didn't go out and buy thousands of shoes. What he did first is he put up the website with a bunch of pictures. And when people ordered it, he'd go down to the store and buy them and then ship them. And then once he got enough volume, then he said, okay, you know, I'm going to figure out a way to scale this and make this work. So, and the only difference between concierge and Wizard of Oz you kind of don't reveal to the customer that that's going on. Whereas in a concierge, you do, and it's very clear. It's like white glove service. You're working very closely with them to understand the mechanics of how the workflow is going to be so you can then productize it, right? That's the idea. In the bottom right quadrant, quantitative product tests, this is where product analytics lives, right? And this is where A/B testing and experimentation lives, right? So if you've got a product, you can see what the usage data is. You can say, you know what, we want to improve the conversion rate. You can try some experiments, and using A/B testing, you can see whether or not any of your experiments actually move the needle on conversion. There's also a fun MVP here, which is the fake door, the 404 page, right? Which is basically before you build anything, you put a button or some conversion action just to see what level of interest there is in that product, right? The example there is Zynga, which was makes mobile games, mobile apps. Before they launched a new game, what they would do is they would put a button to promote the new game they're thinking about making in their existing games and see what kind of conversion rate. And they would try different buttons in different games and see which one had the biggest demand, for example. That's an example of a quantitative fake door 404. Back on the marketing side, any marketing material, you can do a qualitative test. You can show it to customers, get their feedback on, anything, a white paper, a landing page, anything, right? That you've got your pricing matrix, anything that you've got. And then in the quantitative side, that's where, landing page smoke test, you could put a landing page up and see what percentage of people convert, what percentage of people give you their email, that kind of stuff. So again, if you go back to this example from Buffer, I'm pretty sure this plans and pricing button was a smoke test, basically, right? Because they didn't have the product to sign up for. They were trying to validate the market, right? They're trying to validate how much it would work. An explainer video is a more involved version of that, where, if your product is too hard to explain with just static text on a landing page, you could create a video that explains how it works. The famous example here is Dropbox, right? So before they actually built Dropbox, they created a video that would explain how it worked, how it would sync files across your computer via the cloud, right? You can do an ad campaign. If you have an idea for a new product and you want to see how much demand there is, you can try to run an ad campaign. You can run different marketing campaigns to compare the performance, right? And see which benefits or which messaging works better. And then crowdfunding is also an interesting MVP, right? If you think about Kickstarter and sites like that, it's great from a lean startup perspective because you flip it on its head. Before you build the product, you raise the money, you sell it before you build it, right? So especially for hardware products and physical products, crowdfunding sites are a great way to validate that there's demand for it before you spend the resources to build it. So anyway, this is a quick kind of overview categorization of the various different types of MVPs that are out there. But as I said, MVP is really more of a mindset about scope. And look, everybody, if you're building a V1 product, a brand new first-time V1 product, everybody understand how MVPs applies, right? Everybody understand how MVP applies. But I would argue it applies at every product planning milestone, right? If you're trying to figure out what's in our roadmap for the quarter, you've got to apply MVP thinking, what absolutely needs to be in and what can wait. If you're planning a sprint, you've got to decide which user stories are in scope, which ones can wait. That's the idea, right? So it's more of a mindset. And there are different ways to say it, but it's like, what's the minimum set of functionality to create enough customer value? What's the minimum required scope for our next product release? And I like to just simplify by saying, hey, what can we say no to? Like, what can we say no to, right? That's really the essence of MVP, is saying no to something, right? And look, I know in a lot of product managers will be like, Dan, you want me to say no to people? You want me to say no to that senior stakeholder that is insisting that we have this feature? I don't feel like that I'm comfortable doing that. I don't feel like I'm empowered enough to do that. And I hear you. And really, we're not saying no. No sounds too harsh. All we're really saying is not now, not for this release, right? This should always be in the context of a planning milestone, like what's in scope for this release and what's out of scope for this release. And unfortunately, when we have these debates about, hey, is this feature going to be in scope or not? Even though no one's saying it, people act like, well, if I don't get this feature in now, it's never going to get built, right? That's kind of people that are advocating for their pet feature. That's kind of how they act. And it doesn't even become a logical argument at that point. It becomes like an arm wrestling match about you don't want to see who's going to win, who's got the most power, who can, make it work. And, that's really not what it's about. It's really about, hey, we can do whatever we want. As I like to say, we can do whatever we want. We can bite off as much scope or as little scope as we want. There are just implications of that, right? And that's where I like to, bring up this framework, the triangle of software development, sometimes called the iron triangle, that's got these four kind of fundamental, quantities that are kind of like the physics of software development that they have to add up. They have to be in balance, right? And so what are those quantities? Those quantities, resources, like how many people do we have to build this thing, right? And you can get more specific. You could say front-end devs or back-end devs. But the point is, how many people do we have to work on this, like FTEs or whatever? We have the scope, how much stuff do we want to build, right? How many people hours do we think each of those is going to take, right? For the scope. We've got quality, which is not something that's often explicitly discussed. And quality, by the way, doesn't mean just, hey, there's an absence of bugs, the quality of the functionality. It also means quality of everything in the pyramid, everything about, hey, what's the quality level of how much we know about our customer, right? What's the quality level of our product discovery research? What's the quality level of our product strategy? All that, all the decisions that go in before MVP. What are the quality of those decisions, not just quality of the software? And then finally, time, like how long is it going to take to build this thing, right? And so the idea is if we have a certain amount of scope, we know we want to build these 5 features, and we have a quality level that's usually implied, that's implicit that we want to hit, and we have a certain number of developers, then it's going to just take a certain amount of time. Given those 3 other inputs, time is going to be, what you solve for. So, okay, given all that, it's going to take us 3 months. We expect it to take us 3 months. Now, there's obviously estimation error in many things. You could estimate the scope incorrectly. Scope usually ends up being higher than you estimated. You may underestimate resources because someone quits on you or gets sick or something or gets moved to another project, right? Things like that. But we make our estimates, right? Or you could say, you know what? We've got to launch by June 1st. The time is set. We've got to launch by June 1st. We know the quality level we want. We have these 3 developers. Here's our backlog list. How far down the list can we go, right? You can do it that way if you want, right? You can be time-based or you can be scope-based, but they need to add up basically, right? And so what happens, unfortunately, is sometimes leadership will say, I need you to build this set of features with this team, with this quality by this date. And unfortunately, what they've overspecified all 4, and it doesn't add up. Or maybe it added up at one point in time, but then, the scope creep started to happen, or we got burned on our estimates and it's not adding up anymore. One of these has to be what's called a slack variable. One of these has to give, right? You have to have the flexibility for one of these to give to make the other 3 work out, right? And, you may be tempted to be like, no one's going to cut quality on purpose. No one's going to say, yeah, let's launch it with more bugs or let's do this, right? You might skip user testing because of schedule constraints. You might spend less time on UX because of schedule constraints, things like that. You might let a few P2s go by that you wouldn't otherwise, but no one's really going to explicitly let quality go. Resources, you might be tempted to be like, well, we can add some more people to hit that time, the deadline that we were hoping to hit. You could, but guess what? We're all short on resources, right? Every feature team is short on resources. By definition, you should be constrained on your developers. If you're in a software development shop, right? If you're building that, we have way more ideas than people. And if you were to add more people, you wouldn't get as big of an improvement as you would like because it takes time for those people to ramp up on what's going on in the product, what we're trying to accomplish, right? As you have more people, there's more communication and collaboration overhead. And so you kind of get this diminishing returns as you add more people. And there's a whole book called The Mythical Man Month that goes into the details of that. So when you really think about it, in the short run, you really only have 2 real levers, time and scope, right? And so the way that works is, hey, I know we wanted to hit June 1st. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to get all the features we were hoping to get done by June 1st. You have a choice now. You can say, we're either going to keep the list of features and push out the date to resize it, right? Push the date out. Or you can say, nope, we got to hit June 1st no matter what. And we got to reduce the scope. Right. Those are your 2 real levers in the short runs. Right. That's basically it. right? Some combination thereof. And so what I see happen a lot is companies, like I said, they overspecify. The resources are set, the quality is set, the list of features is set, and the deadline of when it needs to get done by is set, right? And it doesn't add up at the beginning often, and then as we build stuff and get surprises, it doesn't add up when we get there. That's the idea, right? And I mentioned briefly, estimation error. One of the things I also see is people are making really like high level estimates, and they're kind of setting themselves up for estimation error. And one thing I learned early in my career is, hey, the amount of accuracy we should expect from engineering estimates is proportional to the level of spec detail that we are providing as product managers, right? That's basically, if you give hey, I need you to estimate this feature, and I give you very little information. If I'm the engineer, I'm going to give you a very conservative estimate, right? Because I don't know yet the details. We haven't talked about the details. As an example, let's say the specification was like the smallest possible, just one word. Hey, I need you to build e-grocery. Hey, VP of engineering, I need you to build an e-grocery website for me. One word. And this is not a fictional example. I had execs ask an engineering team to build e-grocery before. If I'm the head of engineering, I would be like, it could be 12 months. It could be 24 months. I don't have enough to go on yet. That's basically what I mean by if it's low spec, you're going to have a wide range of estimation. Let's say instead, now we have a 2-page document that kind of calls out at a high level what we're expecting the e-grocery to have and to do. Well, now I can tighten my estimate down a little bit. It's only 2 pages. I still don't know all the stuff we need to do. Now, let's say, okay, we have a 6-page doc. We have a full set of mock-ups. We have all the epics and user stories. Well, now I can narrow it down more. You know what I mean? So just one thing to keep in mind as you're doing this high-level product planning is, the scope estimation is only as good as the specification, right? And obviously, we don't have the time when we're doing high-level quarterly roadmap to spec everything out in excruciating detail, but we have to find some middle ground so we can plan. And as I like to remind our senior stakeholder friends, the resources pie just can't be bigger than 100%. I see people trying to jam stuff in and try to magically make the pie be more 100%. Yet theoretically, could the team crank and work overtime and work weekends? Yeah, I mean, you could consider that more than 100% of a normal work week, but that's not sustainable, right? We know that's not sustainable. People will burn out, they'll quit on you. And if you try to go above 100%, you're just fooling yourself. Something will slip. Maybe no one on the team will go, hey, by putting that feature in, it's going to bump this other feature. Maybe you don't say that, one, because no one realizes that, or two, they realize it, but they don't feel comfortable or safe saying it. But we know that's what's going to happen, right? That's what's going to happen. If you try to jam too much stuff in, at the end of the day, it can only be 100%. And then speaking of, certain situations, I like to ask this question about, what is special? These 3 dates of the year, March 31st, June 30th, and September 30th, they're kind of these special dates. They're different than any other dates out of the year. And I like to jokingly call them the magical dates of B2B software, right? It's amazing how many more features launch on these 3 dates versus any other dates. It just happens to be the end of the quarter. That's all it is. It's just the end of the quarter. But we had a quarterly roadmap, and that's what we said was going to get done by the end of the quarter. And the CEO's got to go report to the board, and he wants to be able to tell them that everything shipped. And so all this stuff just kind of piles up, and we go mad rush at the end of the quarter. I don't know if anybody here feels that mad rush at the end of the quarter. That is exactly what I mean by a fixed date mindset, right? That is we have the time cannot flex. We have to launch it by March 31st, right? There's a lot of different things that contribute to that. But if you have a fixed date mindset and you will not flex on scope, then you're setting your team up for failure, right? If you're going to have a fixed date mindset, that's fine. But then you got to flex on scope when stuff comes up, right? And speaking of scope, again, MVP is about right-sizing scope. I like to poke fun, and speaking of B2B, of our friends in enterprise sales, right? When our friends in enterprise sales are out talking to a prospective customer, and the prospective customer says, well, is your new product going to have feature A in it? What does the salesperson usually say? They say, oh, yes. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's going to have feature A. Just sign the contract. So they can get the contract and so they can hit their quota. They say yes. They really have a strong incentive to say yes, even if they have no idea whether it's going to have feature A in it or not, And if it was just one salesperson with one client, it would be okay. But what happens? Every salesperson with every client is saying yes to every question or request like that, right? This is not going to lead you towards having an MVP if this is how we're operating, right? And what I like to say is, and it's not just, sales, it's, we get requests as product people, we get requests all over, right? We get requests from sales. Customers make the request, usually the via sales is passing on customer requests. Sometimes it's from them, what they think is going to be important, prospects, and also internal stakeholders, right? And so you may feel pressure to say yes to every request you get from these groups. But I would argue if you're saying yes to everything, you are not being strategic. Right? That is not, you're basically like an order taker at that point, right? Your job is, you're taking the order, you're the waiter, taking the order and handing it to the kitchen. Some people call it a short order cook or something like, hey, this is what we're doing. And this is where I like to bring up a Steve Jobs quote about focus. And what Steve said was, people think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on, but that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that there are. Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. And I like to just paraphrase it and say, strategy means saying no. This is my favorite definition of strategy. We go back to our friends who are saying yes to everything. They are not doing what Steve Jobs said. They are not being strategic, right? And look, it's easy to say no to dumb ideas or bad ideas. That's easy, right? But if you look at what Steve said, he says it means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that there are. He's acknowledging that the other ideas are good, right? We have more good ideas than we have bandwidth. That's just the nature of software development, right? So you got to figure out where are we going to say no? What's our strategy going to be? And I see often companies that have trouble with this, and they say yes, especially if they're a startup and they're trying to generate revenue. I call it chasing revenue. They're excited that this potential customer is about to sign this contract that needs features A, B, and C, and that this other customer is going to sign the contract and needs features D, E, and F. So they say yes to all comers, and then they figure it out later because they want to make the money. Well, when you do that, you do not have a cohesive product strategy or product roadmap. And what it does, it reminds me of something we have here in the Bay Area. We have this funny house called the Winchester Mystery House. And on the outside, it doesn't look too bad. It actually looks okay on the outside. But what happened is the owner of this house over time added on rooms and modified rooms and restyled rooms and redecorated. And when you go on the inside, you end up with all these crazy things like, here is a staircase that literally goes to nowhere. It just goes to the ceiling. And they put a mirror so you could see that as you go around the corridor, staircase goes nowhere, right? Here, for some reason, there's like window doors in the floor. And so they had to put a banister on it so people don't fall in there. Just randoms of bricks next to, non-brick. Oh, it's just this crazy thing. And, it's the best example I can think of is when you don't say no. If you just do whatever, you build randomly based on what a random walk, based on what customers tell you, you run the risk of building your product, your software product, being like the Winchester Mystery House. What does that mean? I've worked with clients where it's custom software. You've built this one-off thing for this client. You build this other thing for this client. The amount of reuse among these things is low. It's really low. The maintenance is horrible. The tech debt is horrible. You have not built a true product or platform, right? Where you've said, you know what, let's look at what everyone's needs are and build one product or platform that's going to address most of those needs, right? I understand why it happens. You're basically chasing revenue, but it's that lack of discipline of saying no, like Steve said, right? So we got to figure out how to say no in an acceptable way so we can focus on what's important. The other, one of the other examples related to this that stuck with me when I saw it was from actually Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he was teaching a workshop, and he asked someone to come up from the audience, and on the table on the stage, he had a glass jar. And next to the glass jar, he had some kind of big rocks, some pebbles, and some sand. And he asked the person, hey, please fill up the jar with the rocks, pebbles, and sand. And the person proceeded they put the sand in first, and then they put in the pebbles, and then they tried to put the rocks in, but the rocks, there wasn't enough room in the jar for the rocks to fit. So some of the big rocks were not in the jar, right? So what's going on here? Well, what Stephen Covey said is, well, and this is a personal example, I'll tell you the business example in a sec, was, hey, that jar, that represents all the kind of things, that's the amount of time you have in your day or your life or the year, right? That's kind of like the amount of time that you have. And these things are things that take up your time. And the big rocks are like the most important things, like family, health, career, things like that, right? Relationships. Like these are like the big rocks are the most important things. The medium rocks are medium importance, pebbles are small importance, and the sand are all the little things that aren't really important but just take up time, like paying bills and the meeting, the email, all that kind of stuff. That was the personal example. What does it mean in the product world? Well, for me, when you're thinking about your roadmap and MVP, it's the exact same thing. This is the capacity we have for the quarter, right? That we're trying to plan, right? The big rocks or the quarter or the year. The big rocks are those product initiatives that we really think are the most important to really achieve our business objectives, right? To either grow market share or hit whatever OKRs you are. The big rocks are the ones that we are really counting on to hit those. Medium rocks or medium priority, small, and so on, right? Sand is all the little things like the little bug fixes and upgrades and meetings and emails and all that stuff, right? So that's the idea. And so then what he said, hey, I have another jar here with the same amount of rocks and pebbles and sand. What I want you to do this time is I want you to put the big rocks in first, then put in the medium rocks, then put in the little pebbles, and then put in the sand. And there's no trickery going on. When you do it that way, the sand can go around all the cracks and everything fits just fine in the jar, right? So what's the moral of this example? The moral of this example is, allocate resources to your big rocks first. Don't let the sand dominate. If you let it, the sand will dominate, right? All the little things, death by 1,000 cuts, you may never get to the big rocks that you're really counting on to move the needle for your OKRs, for your organization, right? And one of the things is, with Agile, we work in 2-week increments. Agile, some teams can get down to the point where all they ever do is sand and little pebbles, and they never manage to, chip away at a medium rock or a big rock because they can only ever do things at, 2-week intervals. So it's just something to be mindful of when you're planning, and you're thinking about your MVP, like what are the big rocks? What really matters the most? One last example here. This is from Yahoo. So earlier in Yahoo's history, they were having trouble. A lot of people at the company felt like they didn't have a clear strategy. They were trying to be everything to everybody and do too many things. And so this executive basically said, our strategy is described as spreading peanut butter across the myriad opportunities, right? The result, a thin layer of investment spread across everything we do. And thus we focus on nothing in particular, right? So basically, when I see a company trying to do too much and spreading themselves too thin, right? You're not going to be able to get a meaningful big rock done if you spread your resources too thin. So I call that peanut buttering. And so again, we want to avoid that. We want to be mindful of what the big rocks are. Okay, so with that advice out of the way, how do we actually reach a decision or recommendation or agreement on what should be in scope for the MVP and what can wait? The way I like to do that is with a basic roadmap visualization where we have, for our roadmap, whatever time frame we're talking about, we have our themes, right? Themes should be customer problems that we're trying to solve or like business metrics / OKRs we're trying to improve. And then we have time going left to right. And the point here is we have a lot of feature ideas that correspond to each of these swim lanes or themes, and we need to decide which ones are in scope or not, right? And so obviously we would want to prioritize them before we did this exercise. But what we want to do is put a proposal out there that says, hey, for V1, and what this means, 1A means a feature 1A. The 1 corresponds to theme 1. So it's basically feature A for theme 1, feature A for theme 2, feature A for theme 5, right? And then that's it for version 1. That's the proposal, is that it would only have those. And then the idea would be, hey, in the next version, let's call it 1.5, we're going to, go further on theme 5. We're going to start to address theme A. And then in the next version, we're going to go further with theme 1, further with theme 3. In version 2.5, we're going to start to address theme 4 and go further in theme 5, right? This is an example of a roadmap where we've got our features, but we're getting clear about which ones need to be done now and which ones can wait and what's the order that we expect, right? That's the idea. And so back to what we were saying earlier, this would be the MVP candidate, right? Because we haven't actually tested it. We don't know if it's viable. The V means viable. It's our candidate. It's what we think will be viable based on our research and our, basically analysis that we've done, right? You don't just do this randomly. It's by having confidence that you've got the customer right, their needs right, the value prop right, that you can do this and say, okay, this should be good enough, right? So that's the idea. This is how I like to see it. And this is where if you don't have a simple visualization like this, if I'm the stakeholder who really wants feature 3A to be in scope, if I don't have this visualization, I can't see that it's the very next feature you plan to build. Maybe if I saw this visualization, I might be okay waiting for feature 3A because I know it's the very next thing you plan to build, right? But in absence of this, it's hard for people to see that, right? So this is how I like to get explicit about scope. We take our features, our prioritized features, and we actually put them out in different versions, right? Now, this is just our plan. We may go test this MVP with customers and find we're completely wrong and have to redo this whole plan. It doesn't mean the plan's not useful, right? There's that famous Eisenhower quote. It's like plans are useless, but planning is essential. The point of having the planning is to get people aligned on what we expect to happen. Now, what I want to cover is a few mistakes the top mistakes that teams make with MVPs. The first mistake is actually ironic because it is people overscoping their MVP. Their MVPs are bigger than they need to be. And it's ironic because what's the whole point of an MVP? It's to not overscope what you're planning to do. How does this happen? The way this happens is, let's say there's some lean team that says, you know what, we've done our research, we know our customers, we think this will be viable. And we should just build these 3 features, or prototype something with these 3 features and get feedback and go on from there. And then some stakeholder sees this roadmap and they see 3A here and they go, wait a minute, are you serious? You're not going to have feature 3.1A in the MVP? Oh my gosh, I think big client X is going to think that's horrible. Our product's going to be, bad. The press is going to tear us apart. We're going to be the laughing stock of the industry. I can't believe you're not going to have feature 3A in there, right? Usually that's the tenor of the argument. It's like there's a lot of conviction and passion. Usually it's someone senior. Obviously, they're not just randomly doing it. They think that it's really critical for it to be in there. But the team has decided, you know what, it can actually wait, right? That's the idea, right? And so what usually happens in that scenario? Product team buckles and says, okay, big stakeholder wants the feature. I guess we got to put it in. And so they kind of reluctantly agree and they put it in. But what just happened, right? Nobody talked about it. But remember that triangle we talked about? You just added some scope. You didn't cut quality. You didn't add resources. So if you added scope, what did you do? You added time. Did anybody talk about the delay that was going to be incurred by moving this in? No. Usually that doesn't happen. It's just a political debate, political discussion about, 3A, good, bad, in, out, that's it. And usually it's an arm wrestling match, like I said, right? Unfortunately, people don't talk about it. And if it stopped there, it would be fine. But then what happens? A day or two later, some other stakeholder goes, wait a minute, you're not going to have feature 5B? Are you crazy? That's such an important feature. I think, we really need that. It's going to be horrible without it. A lot of times there's a lot of emotion and hand waving and stuff, not necessarily a lot of data or evidence that goes with these stories. And then what does the team do? Okay, I guess we got to put that in. Next thing you know, they're adding all the features into their MVP, and now it's bloated. And now the time to release is going to be pushed out more and more. It's really not an MVP anymore. So that's the top thing that I see happen. And look, I understand, the people that are advocating for this, it comes from a good place, which is, I'm just worried this is not going to be adequate. This is going to be inadequate. And if we add, basically, it's like the general idea is the more features we stuff in there, the better the odds it's going to create value for customers. Something in there, they're going to find something they like in there, right? You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like throwing spaghetti at the wall. And the general idea is, hey, if we throw more spaghetti at the wall, we have a better chance some of it will stick, right? That is not a very scientific way to create products, right? I understand all the stuff. I understand all the sentiment and emotions behind it, but we should have got to a point where we built a case why we thought this was good enough, right? Now, if you're in this situation, what's my advice for how to handle it? In my workshop, I'll ask people, I'll pose that exact situation, and people are like, well, we'll just go talk to them. We'll show them the data. We'll try to persuade them. Hey, you already tried to do all that. They are dug in. They are convinced that you need this feature. You are convinced you do not need the feature. You are at an impasse. How could we possibly get by this impasse? Because if you just say yes, you just took the hit. You didn't test anything, right? So what I like to say is, how might we test this? How might we test this? And so what I like to do is I like to try to do a little Jedi mind trick on this person and say, okay, sounds like you have a hypothesis that this MVP will not create enough value for customers if it doesn't have 3A in it. Is that your hypothesis, right? And they might look at you funny, like, when you talk about hypothesis, I just want the feature in there. It's like, no, but that's what your rationale is, right? It's your hypothesis, right? They say, yeah. I say, okay, I understand your hypothesis. The team's hypothesis is that actually it will create enough value with just these 3 features without that feature. How might we test our 2 hypotheses, right? And my favorite way to test that is, let's do a quick wireframe of this product without 3A. I bet you are so convinced that this is so critical and this is going to be so horrible that if we tested with 10 customers, I bet you would think all 10 would complain about 3A missing. Is that right? Usually they're so fired up, like, yeah, they're all going to complain. And then I go, okay, I'll tell you what, if 8 or more of the 10 mention something about, hey, where's feature 3A? I really need feature 3A. Then we'll be the first to admit, hey, we were wrong, mea culpa. You're right. We need to put it in. But can you agree that if we show it to 10 people and fewer than 8 say anything about it, that we're okay? Right? Or you can set it at 6 or 7, whatever number you want to do, right? But that way you're setting it up as a test and you're getting real customer data instead of going off someone's gut or intuition or fear or concerns, right? So that's how I like to resolve it. Because again, if you don't put it in, if you just put it in, you're not testing anything, you're taking the hit, right? And look, all these features are good ideas. They're on our roadmap, right? The reason 3A and 5B are the next feature we're going to build is because they're like the high priority features. No one's saying they're dumb ideas or bad ideas. That's not the question, right? Unfortunately, these debates devolve into, is this feature worth doing or not worth doing? Like, no, they're all kind of worth doing to some level, but there's different degrees of ROI and what we need, right? And so this is saying, hey, it doesn't make the cut here, but we would want to follow up with it. When you're talking and when you're having this, when you're in the room talking about this feature and everyone's focusing on this feature, of course, it's a good idea. Why wouldn't we do 3A? We could say that about any of these features. Why wouldn't we do 5B? No one's saying we shouldn't do it, but it's like that. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of a cute puppy. How could you say no to this feature? Look at this feature. It's so cute. Oh, how could you say no, right? Each of these feature ideas that we're thinking about doing is like a cute puppy. In isolation, it's cool, it's great, it's cute, And maybe the reason someone's pushing for that puppy is what's called shiny object syndrome, right? Sometimes there's some hot new thing. I just heard a podcast about blockchain. What's our blockchain strategy? We got to get a blockchain feature in there, right? That would be a shiny object syndrome. Right now, it'd be generative AI. What's our Gen AI strategy? We got to get Gen AI. Whatever. There's always a technology, of du jour, or maybe it's the HIPPO. HIPPO stands for highest paid person's opinion, right? Maybe the HIPPO is saying, I really think we need this feature, right? That can lead to, hey, I really think we're getting a lot of pressure to put this idea in. We think it can wait, but we're getting a lot of pressure, right? The problem is we have a lot of puppies. It's not just one puppy. We have tons of great ideas. So, right, we have to figure out some way to figure out which puppies do we say yes are in scope for MVP, and how do we defer some of these for post MVP, right? If we have the mindset that all puppies are wonderful and all features are great and all of them are equally valuable, we're not going to be able to discriminate to plan out our MVP. This idea of having trouble prioritizing ideas and saying no resonated so much with one of my clients. They actually made a t-shirt that said prioritize the puppies because they're basically were having trouble with that. So we got to prioritize the puppies. Of course, these feature ideas are good ideas. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in our roadmap. Okay. The other mistake I see, not as common now, but when companies were transitioning from waterfall to agile, which a lot of companies have done by now, there's the idea of some of them would just take their waterfall process and arbitrarily chop it up into 1 month chunks, right? And so there's a pretty well-known MVP diagram. I have to say at the beginning, it's not my favorite diagram. I don't 100% agree with it, but it conveys this one point, which is, hey, if we're trying to build a car and we do it like this, there's frowny faces until the end. Why is that? Well, you're building it incrementally. Yes, it's true. You're building it incrementally, but the user doesn't get any value out of it till the end, right? So they can't use this. They can't use this. They can't get any value out of it. So this is like taking waterfall and just building things, chopping it up, but you still don't get the final product till the end of the waterfall anyway. So again, it's not a perfect diagram, but what they're trying to advocate is, hey, we want to have some intermediate milestones. Yes, we want intermediate milestones, but at each of those intermediate milestones, we want it to be something that the user can actually use and get value out of. And of course, we want the value to grow over time. So that's what this is trying to convey, right? The engineer in me would love it if there were like component reuse across this and stuff. But but that's the point. The point is, hey, instead of doing it the waterfall way, how can we create some intermediate milestones that make sense, right, for us and for the user? The last mistake I see teams make with MVP, I like to explain with another pyramid, which comes from Aaron Walters. So Aaron Walters wrote a great book called Designing for Emotion. It came out quite a while ago, probably 12 or 13 years ago. So he actually has a second edition that came out 2 or 3 years ago. I actually hosted him at the meetup. You can see his talk. And he was the head of UX design at MailChimp. I'm not surprised that he created this framework, because basically what he was trying to do, let me explain it here, is when you're thinking about a product, he's trying to tease apart 4 different aspects of the product. How functional is the product? How reliable is the product? How usable is the product? How delightful is the product, right? The whole reason he was doing this was to try to elevate the discussion at the time from usability to delight. That's why he was doing this, right? It's been a long time. Everybody should have got the memo that, hey, your product needs to be usable. There are still plenty of products out there that aren't usable, but the team can't tell us that they didn't know it was supposed to be useful, right? Usable, right? So usability answers the question, can people use your product? Delight answers the question, do people want to use your product? How do they feel when they use your product? So again, his whole point was try to elevate the discussion from usability to delight. Now, if we tie it back to MVP, the idea is you start with an empty, all 4 of these layers are empty, and we can use this triangle to color in, what do we plan to do for MVP? How much of each of these layers do we plan to realize in our MVP? And we know we're not going to realize the whole triangle because that would be waterfall. So the mistake that many teams make is they use MVP as an excuse to do this. So what is this saying? This is saying, hey, we colored in a subset of functionality. That's actually good because we didn't bite off all the puppies, right? We managed to prioritize and say, we're going to launch this subset, but we didn't color in any of these other layers, right? What does that mean? Well, we focused on building the functionality, but we didn't really make sure it was reliable. We didn't focus on making it usable or delightful, right? And usually this again goes with a lack of understanding of how it's supposed to work, as well as time pressures. Yeah, I know it had more bugs than we wanted, but we had to hit that June 1 release date. So we'll fix the bugs later. It's just an MVP. Yeah, I know we didn't get a chance to work on the UX design as much as we wanted or do the user testing, but gosh, we had to hit that date and it's just an MVP, right? So that people use this phrase, it's just an MVP, as an excuse to cut corners on these important aspects of a product, right? But then what happens is they launch this product. How well do you think it does? It doesn't do well. It doesn't matter if you have functionality. If it doesn't work reliably, if people can't figure out where it is or how to use it, you don't get credit. It doesn't actually create value. For your functionality to create value, it's got to be reliable and usable at a minimum, right? And so it's true that and then they say, oh, see, it didn't work. And they like to go back to waterfall, so MVP thing didn't work, but they just didn't do it right? So it's true that you want to build a slice, but you want the slice to look more like this, right? For whatever subset of functionality you do bite off, you want it to be reliable enough. It's not going to be perfect, but reliable enough and usable enough and delightful enough that you're actually getting a real test of your MVP, right? That's the whole point of an MVP is to get a test of what you're doing. And if you do this, it's not going to do well, right? So that's basically it. And I have my new favorite MVP metaphor that kind of ties into this. And again, it's often because of deadlines that this happens, right? Either a lack of understanding and or deadlines. So let's say, we make a plan for the product that we plan to launch, at the end of the quarter, and we envision it as this nice, beautiful horse that we plan. We're going to build this product. It's going to be like this nice, beautiful horse. And we start the quarter, we make our plans, we start the quarter, we start building it. Everything's going great. Everything's fine. Then we get to the middle of the quarter. We're getting a little behind schedule. We hit some unexpected surprises. Maybe some people quit. Maybe people try to jam in new features. And then it's getting to the end of the quarter. It's like, we got to ship the thing to get it out the door. And you're cutting corners left and right? Don't let this happen to your product. I've seen this happen, especially with fixed date, right? If you insist on that June 1st deadline, this will happen. Corners will get cut on functionality, on UX, on reliability. That's just what's going to happen, right? So I'm sure some people here can relate to products they worked on where this happened. And then the last thing I want to share here on MVP is a lot of times, and I focused a lot on the P part, like what's the scope of functionality? What's the scope of functionality that we need, right? But if you go back to the words product market fit, that's really focusing on the product part. An important part of MVP also is, well, who's the market? Who's the customer that we're going to use, right? So for a second, let me just show the two dimensions that we're talking about. So we have functionality where 100% means, hey, here's all the functionality we plan to build, and how are we going to go roll it out? How are we going to go from 0% functionality to 100%? And then on the other axis, we have our customer base, right? From the 0% to 100. Basically, figuring out your MVP and your roadmap is, what's our plan? Right now, we haven't built any of the new functionality, and therefore it's not in any of our 0% of our customers' hands. And we know we eventually want to build all the functionality 100%, and we want to get it rolled out to all of our customers. What should our plan be for doing that, right? And, this is one way of doing it, but this is probably not the best plan. What is it saying? This is saying, hey, we're going to build all the features, and then we're going to roll them out to everybody all at once. This is the riskiest way to do stuff, right? This is basically waterfall development with a full public rollout with no throttling or no betas or anything, right? That's what this is basically saying. This is the old way, right? Pre-lean, pre-agile way. And it's very risky because you basically you build all this stuff before you interact with customers, and whether you realize they like it or not. And so what you want to do is identify what we've been talking about is, how do we identify the subset of functionality we need for V1? But the flip side of it too is, and to whom are we going to roll it out? Right? It goes hand in hand that you might say, we're going to roll this out to our customers that only need these features. We know there are other customers that need those other features, but we want to get this thing going. And so we're going to roll it out to the people that have simpler needs to get the flywheel going of customer feedback. And then when we get that feedback, then we'll build some more functionality, and we'll expand the number of customers we have, right? And we'll expand the functionality, we'll expand the customers, we'll eventually get out there, right? So here, instead of doing it in one fell swoop, we're having 1, 2, 3, 4 milestones to get where we're thinking of going, right? And I don't know what the right number is for your business, but you don't, one of the mistakes I see teams make, especially if your definition of MVP is it's got to be publicly available, then everything they build, they just launch to everybody right away, right? That's their MVP, is they launch it to everybody. Well, that's not really an MVP. I would want to launch it to get some private beta group of people to get some feedback on it before I launched it out, right? So not only are you breaking down the functionality into chunks, you should be breaking down your customers and saying, okay, who should we be rolling out the alpha or beta to? And then who should be expanded to? Eventually you'll get to public deployment, right? That's the idea. And so it's also, as we mentioned a couple of times, an MVP is a hypothesis, right? You need to be ready to be wrong. Like most companies, when they build an MVP or a V1 product, they don't get it all right. So you've got to be willing to do it. So again, my point is, even if we decided on the V1 functionality, I would want to prototype it and test it before we built it, right? So sometimes people just try to do MVP, but they still build it as opposed to testing it with a prototype first. And I want to show you, with testing with prototypes, what's really going on. Basically in my other talks, I talk about problem space, solution space. We're making all these hypotheses, as we've talked about a couple of times, and you can think about it like we're heading in a certain direction based on our best judgment and decisions. We say, okay, we think we need to be heading in this direction with our product, call it a product vector. And then we create mock-ups or a prototype or a live product, right? Or a proof of concept or something, or it's some solution space thing. Personally, I hope you do a prototype before you code it, but hey, whatever it is. And then you show that to customers, right? And then they give you reactions. They go, well, I like this, I don't like this. They give you a course correction, right? And you take that feedback from the test and you go like, okay, we got these things right. We didn't get these things quite right. How do we want to iterate? Do we need to pivot? How are we going to iterate this? You revise your hypotheses, and then you create a new set of mockups and code, and you go and test with users again, and they're going to give you another correction. Now, hopefully the course corrections get smaller over time, but you're basically using your mockups or prototypes, or worst case, your code, as an artifact to go back and forth, right? To test with customers, to get the feedback, to revise your hypotheses. That's the idea, right? So because you can only go so far by having abstract discussions with customers. Showing them a mock-up or a prototype is very valuable to really understand, do people even want what we're thinking about building? Let's figure that out before we build it, right? And I have this loop that I mentioned in my book about the learning or iteration loop, where it starts off with, we form hypotheses, we design ways to test those hypotheses, we test hypotheses, and from those tests, we gain learning. And from the learning and insights, we revise our hypotheses. So we're iterating, right? That's basically it. If we superimpose problem space and solution space, this is basically how it looks. We're forming hypotheses in the problem space. We're designing prototypes in the solution space. We're testing those solution space prototypes with customers. And then we're getting learnings and insight that we then, iterate with. That's the idea. And hopefully you do this, you iterate your MVP and everything's cool. You're off to the races. But sometimes you need to decide, hey, we're not quite getting the response we want. Do we persevere or pivot, right? This is often an important decision. And the whole point of MVP is like, let's figure this out before we invest in coding anything. Wouldn't it be great to figure this out with prototypes before we invest in coding stuff? And the metaphor I like to use here is like kind of climbing up a mountain. And, you start at the very bottom of the mountain. And basically the higher up the mountain you're able to get to climb, the more product market fit, the more customer value you're creating, right? And so you start off, maybe you get this high with your V1 product. Again, hopefully you keep iterating and iterating and you go climb right to the top of that mountain. Everything's great. You achieve product market fit. But sometimes you may find, okay, we got some feedback from this first round. Let's tweak it. Okay, we got a little bit of a bump. Gosh, we're just not really, we're trying to rearrange and change stuff, but we can't seem to get to a high enough value with customers. That's where you might want to consider a pivot, right? And one way to think about this mountain is this is the market opportunity, that the original market opportunity you're going after, which back to the product market fit pyramid is a group of people that share a set of common needs. Well, you might realize or decide that, hey, we need to pivot to a different market opportunity, right? And that pivot just means you're changing one of the major hypotheses that you had in the product market fit pyramid. Maybe you're changing your value proposition, or you're changing which problems you're trying to solve, or you're changing which target customer you're going after, right? And so maybe by going to this adjacent market, we then are able to basically, achieve product market, a higher level of product market fit than we could going after this market opportunity, right? So basically product market fit is basically getting enough data to validate that you're climbing up the right mountain, right? And that's how we want to use MVPs. Again, hopefully prototypes before we build. Okay, so that's the MVP advice I have for you all. I want to thank everybody. All right, Matt, go for it.
So I've been in many of these conversations that are like arm wrestling matches or shouting matches, or hey, it's my way or the highway. What's your advice for navigating some of those discussions and conversations, especially with strongly held opinionated people who don't have a lot of evidence? They just talked to a customer or two, or had a sales call and was like, hey, this is a great idea. Yeah. We should do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, a few things. One is, if you have a product roadmap already, then when these ideas come out of left field, you can just pull up the roadmap and be like, great, pie can only be 100%. What do you want to bump? Right. Or you can be like, hey, yeah, today you're asking me for shiny object A. Last week, you asked me for shiny object B. The day before that, you asked me for C. Can you help me understand the relative priority of these things you're asking of me, right? So there's a different techniques. Or one is, because, a lot of times those people don't understand how product works. They don't understand resource trade-offs. They don't understand all this stuff. They just want everything, right? They don't care, or they don't really care to know what's involved or if it's possible. They just want it. And so what you're trying to do, a lot of times I call product managers reality messengers. Like, you're just a reality messenger. Hey, here's the other features we were planning to do. What would you want to bump to do that, right? And then the interesting thing then is that's that one person's opinion, right? And then there might be some other stakeholder who's like, no, I don't agree with that. So instead of you being the bad guy, you can then be like, well, so-and-so is recommending that we bump this feature because of this. And then you go find who cares about that feature, right? And then the other technique, like I just said, is if someone's asking for a lot of stuff, you can say, well, we've gotten several requests from your organization. Here they are. Let's have a meeting and make sure we're clear on your relative priorities, right? So they have to rank order them. That's that make sense? So you just like, okay, you've given us 10 ideas in the last 3 weeks. I need you to prioritize the ideas,
Sure.
So that it's like you're not having to deal with it, right? So that's something. And then as much as you can, drive for evidence or data. So if somebody says, oh, we need this feature, be like, oh, great. Hey, what evidence or data do we have that supports that? And if they say, oh, I talked to customer X, I mean, great. That's great that you talked to customer X. Do we have any data of like what percentage of our customers would also agree that that's valuable or not, right? And you look, asking those questions isn't probably going to make a huge difference right then and there. But hopefully over time, if you're a broken record, it'll start to sink in that we need to have evidence and data. And you know what I mean? People hopefully will start asking those questions. And then again, you can be like, well, that feature is going to take a lot of time to build. We think it's worthwhile to test to try to get some firsthand data, whether or not it really needs to be in scope or not. I'd like to propose we do this wireframe test, right? And usually they're so convinced about their point of view, they will gladly agree to the test because they're so convinced they're going to win. The test is going to go their way, right? The only argument they may say is, well, we don't have time for the test, right? And so that's where you got to have like someone who can wireframe. You got to have customers ready to go so you can kind of get quick results. So that's some advice.
One of the strategies I employed recently was a combination of having these monthly discussions with customers where we invited our stakeholders along to listen and hear firsthand from the customers what it is they're actually looking for. And then bringing them along the journey a little bit more in some of the prospecting calls and discovery calls and whatnot. And thirdly, we put together, obviously schedule for this MVP to show them, okay, you said you wanted all this stuff, but hey, you can't fit it all in. So like you said, what are we going to bump here?
Yeah. And I like one of the things you said to pick up on is, firsthand customer data and contact is critical, right? All these people that are telling you what they think customers want, they're acting as proxies for customers. It's a salesperson saying, yeah, this person told me that they want this feature, or they didn't tell me, but I know the industry and everybody needs this feature, or, hey, all of our competitors have this feature, so we just need this feature, right? That's right. I'm losing because we don't have this feature, right? So those would all be examples of, where it's not firsthand data. And so I like your idea of like, hey, let's make sure we always get firsthand data, because that's where the risk comes in, and like in a court of law, you can't say, yeah, Matt told me this. That's called hearsay. Like you need firsthand evidence in a court of law, right? So it's the same kind of thing. It's like, how many degrees away from the actual customer is this data, right? Did they act, so, and I as a PM, I want to have that firsthand customer contact as much as possible as a way to mitigate it. So that's a good point. I guess another tactic is, hey, let's, we've got these 10 features. Let's rope in the customer and have them help us prioritize these 10 features for them, right? So yeah, but a lot of times instead of that's the thing is if you have a yes mindset, then you have no basis for pushing back. Instead, It should be like, hey, we can do all these things, but they're going to take time. So we just have to prioritize them. So somehow co-opting the person and getting them actively involved in prioritization instead of allowing them to be like a victim and be like, hey, I don't know, whatever. I just need you to build it all. Right. But instead saying, okay, we need to prioritize these things. Let's prioritize it together. It's just then you're dragging them into the reality constraints. Right. So.
Yeah. And then how does this balance with your strategy? Like, what do you want to accomplish this year for the business? And are these things that your customers are saying yes to do this?
Right.
Are they really making sense?
Right. Related to that, if you're losing the argument, then what you can do is say, okay, sounds like you really think this is an important feature. Let's set an expected target. Like what percentage of, how much is this going to get used? Is it going to get used like every day, every week? Like how many users do we think is going to use it? And you just set some goal. And you have to do it before you launch because otherwise people will revise it. And so then you at least have some accountability. Like I couldn't win the argument to get this feature, to not put this feature in, but I want to set up the accountability so that if it doesn't get used, if it goes the way I expect and it's not actually going to get used, that we have a feedback loop where we can say, you know what? See, you thought it was going to 30,000 people were going to use it. Only 1,000 used it. we keep overestimating the value of these features and how many people are going to use it, right? And then you got to get a meta longer term conversation going of like, look, we've tracked the statistics over the last 5 features you push for. Only 1/10 of the users you estimated actually ended up using it. What do we want? We got to change how we're operating. You know what I mean? That's a way to kind of get a longer term discussion.
And can you bring the trio into the discussion, right? And go back to what you said about, okay, let's look at the themes and how far are we going to go? And let's have a productive conversation about experimentation here with the executive stakeholder who is so strongly opinionated about this, or whomever it happens to be. And let's talk about an experimentation roadmap then. Okay, so we've agreed this is something we're going to do, but how far are we going to go? And how's the trio going to help us, in figuring out how far we go with this? And is there some negotiation we need to do there, perhaps?
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Dan.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. I see Peter made a comment. The roadmap has been the best defense I've seen so far when applied with we want this. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. If you don't have a roadmap, there's no you're like on a foundation of sand. Why can't you build it? Why not? I mean, it's just you need to have some roadmap, some initial plan that you can then talk about deltas, changes to the plan, in a zero-sum kind of way, hopefully. So, okay, cool. Carrie has a question. Why don't we get you up here, Carrie? Go for it.
Hey, Dan. So which question? I've got 2. One was expanding on Jessica and Matt's question, and then the other is viability. Cool. Okay. Great. So just to be kind of, you touched on this just now. Just to be crystal, do you ever advocate going through a fresh MVP process each time you do a next version?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, versions, if it's a V1, then most people are like, we should do an MVP. If it's a major release, like a V2 or V3, people might think about it too, right? So, but what one company, uses for the delta of a version 1 versus version 2 could be different from another company. So the way I like to say it is if there's enough scope and enough uncertainty about are people going to like what we're planning to build, that's when you would want to basically do an MVP prototype, right? But again, I would say for any planning milestone, whether you call it an MVP or not, you want to apply that thinking of what absolutely needs to be in scope for this milestone and what can wait, right? Because the more stuff we can cut, the sooner we'll get that MVP prototype in people's hands, the sooner we'll get feedback on the prototype, the sooner we'll really solidify what do we actually need to build, and the sooner we'll build it and get it in market, right? So that's kind of the idea. I'd recommend that. Yeah, look, if it's a minor enhancement, you just, like say it's a UX design fix or something, you might just, you still, it might be good if it's a UX design fix, it'd be good to show a prototype to make sure you're fixing it with your new UX design, right? But if the scope is small and the risk is low, you might just roll it out without doing some of these techniques, right? So it's basically like the more uncertainty there are in your hypotheses, the more you're going to invest, the bigger the risk of like, hey, we just invested all this effort and time. We weren't sure if people were going to like it or not, right? Yeah. Then the more you should lean towards MVP ideas.
Great. That is actually just a perfect segue to my other question. Okay. I'm wondering if you would mind throwing up the slide that has your pyramid where functional is at the bottom and delightful is at the top.
Sure. And so this is this slide, which has delight, usable, reliable, and functional. Just a real quick note, like one of my clients, they were drawing this and they didn't want to write out all these long words in the second pyramid. So they just put DURF. So this is affectionately called the DURF pyramid, just for what it's worth. Okay.
All right. We've got a new consonant to add to it.
Yes.
So my question, as you know, I'm in the healthcare world now, and it's so much harder than just plain old B2B is harder than D2C. It's exponentially harder. And so my question is the word buyable. And at first I was thinking, do we need a buyable at the top as part of the test?
Oh.
And then I realized actually in healthcare and medtech, it's like buyable needs to belong sadly at the very, very bottom. Like who in a notorious, my question finally is in a notoriously complex buying market.
Yes.
Where nobody literally no party wants to have to pay for doing the right thing for the patient or the clinician or whatever. How and where do you do MVP testing on the viability of something when you've already when you've got something that satisfies all these other layers?
Interesting. Yeah. So that gets back to what we were talking about when I didn't actually, when I share the pyramid, I usually share that if you have more than one customer that you need to satisfy, then you need more than one pyramid. And so the classical example is in B2B or enterprise. You've got the end user, and you need to think about what are their needs, what's their value prop, what's their feature set, what's their UX. And then you have the business, the buyer, if you will, right? And so what the buyer cares about, they have their own needs that they care about, right? The B2C examples of this would be like Uber. They have riders and drivers. Airbnb, they have renters and guests, right? So that's the idea. What I hear you saying is, hey, Dan, what about a theoretical situation where we feel pretty good about what we have for the user, for the customer pyramid, but we're having trouble with the buyer pyramid. The buyers aren't going for it, right? So what you need to do is basically apply the same techniques of clarifying who are the buyers, what are their underserved needs, how can we meet those needs in a way that's better? And that's where things like pricing and, revenue model stuff, insurance and all that kind of stuff could come into play. So it's a good point. If I go back to that other slide, the way I interpret what you're saying is going back to the DERF pyramid real quick is, hey, where does the business case viability come in, business model viability come in? And so you could theoretically, it could be a distinct item, but basically what I like to say is, when you're going after a new product, there's different categories of risk, right? And there could be true technical risk. Like if we're trying to send people to Mars, right? Or we're trying to build the first electric car, there can be real technical risk, right? Or ChatGPT, right? It's like, can we even do this? That's true technical risk. Unfortunately, for most software products, I'm not trying to minimize but it's just hey, it's a database, it's a front end. We've been doing this for years. It's not the level of technical risk of those other things I just mentioned, where it's real R&D, that kind of a stuff, right? We use the term moonshot for the odds of it working and things like that. Then you should go mitigate that first. That's what you should do. Go see if the technology even will work. Do R&D and mitigate that risk, right? The number one reason in my mind most products fail is they don't solve a customer need, right? They just don't. So this says functional. That's really code for solves a customer need. That's really code for this stuff, right? And so for me, most products fail. They don't get product market fit because they're not really solving a need in a compelling way, right? It's these layers are not it's sometimes you can say, oh, it's execution risk. Rarely do companies fail because of execution risk. It's usually because at the end of the day, they were building something they thought was going to create a lot of value. And it just, the people are no, actually it doesn't create value for me, right? Because they didn't articulate their hypotheses. They didn't test their hypotheses. I would say if business risk is the biggest, then maybe that's what we need to mitigate first, right? And I could see that, for example, say pharma. There's hundreds of different diseases we could try to find cures to, right? And unfortunately, we'd want to obviously cure them all if we could. But if you're going to take a business lens through it, then they're going to say, well, what's the market size for each of these diseases? And they're probably going to prioritize the diseases that more people have, or that, what I mean, than the ones that fewer people have. And then that's going to inform their product pipeline. Okay, which drug should we go put in R&D? We're going to go for the one, you know what I mean? So there might be a similar thing in your market where it's you need to validate the buyer side. If that's the biggest risk, if you keep finding that, gosh, and in certain sales processes or ecosystems like healthcare or education, I've worked with a couple ed clients. It's a tough sales cycle to navigate. There's multiple people involved in the ecosystem. You got the insurance side, you've got the provider side. In the education, you've got the district, you got the superintendent, you got the teachers, and and like in education, they make their purchase decisions for the next school year by the spring. So if you haven't closed the deal by the spring, you just missed the whole year of sales kind of thing, right? So sometimes you get those very specific dynamics or challenging dynamics on the business side. And if that's what's slowing you down or causing issues, then I would reallocate resources to say, how can we mitigate those? Apply the same techniques of forming hypotheses and testing things to see how we can mitigate those risks.
So how I interpreted that is I'm thinking with your two slides that you showed, it seems to me almost the first thing should be to go to the customer, the paying. Well, first of all, just figure out if you can possibly think of anybody who you could arm wrestle into paying for something that's good for, healthcare's got so many unmet needs, right?
Yeah.
So maybe starting there first with defining the MVP for that feature set. And then once you think you've got something that a buyer might go for, then coming up with a pyramid of functional, blah, 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 up through delightful for the users. And trying to start there where you solved a buyer problem before a user problem, a user need problem. Yeah. And rather than starting with the user need and then sadly getting the want of nobody wants to pay for it and having to go completely back to the drawing board and invent a new functional through delight.
Right. You know what it makes me think of, Carrie? Like there's the business model canvas, right, which has been around for a while, where you actually, my framework is really kind of like a double click on the product aspects, right? My framework is, okay, if I believe most products fail because of product market fit risk, I'm going to help people mitigate that. I don't have any real advice on how to mitigate tech R&D risk or mitigate this business risk, other than kind of doing a back of the envelope spreadsheet, do the unit economics workout, which is different than kind of what we're talking about. But in the business model canvas, right, from Alex Osterwalder, it has all the things of like, all the things you need to think about for the whole thing to work. And so I would recommend checking that out. And I think you'll find, based on what you're saying, that, the biggest risks are not in the product areas, they're in this buyer side stuff. And that would make sense. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I need all of it. So thank you so much. I love your
Sure. All right. Thanks. You're welcome. I think Jessica is the other one.
I'm trying to remember exactly what my question was. Was it around the roadmap? Yeah. And I think someone made a good point around kind of giving yourself time to test. And I think you also mentioned, because I was popping in and out, but making stakeholders agree that through customer discovery, those later initiatives or features needed to be validated. But I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit more towards kind of building out a roadmap with that MVP mentality at the core.
Totally. Yeah. And the themes are important. So what you're saying is basically how you recommend what themes to go after. You said beyond V1, but I would argue even for V1, you have to answer that question, right? So that's where, again, this talk was focused on MVP, but I'll share my screen again. That's the value proposition layer, really, is like, what benefits are we going to offer, solve for people, and how are we going to be better or different? Your themes are going to come out of that from your product strategy, basically, right? And what I would say is your themes are not, if we look at that roadmap swim lane visualization, they're not going to change. They shouldn't. You shouldn't be like, okay, we launched V1, now let's get a whole new set of themes. These are like kind of evergreen, relatively long duration themes of customer problem areas that you plan to address, right? And usually to really nail those areas and deliver world-class value, it's going to take a while to do that, right? So, for example, you take TurboTax. In some of my other talks, I use the example of TurboTax, right? It's a product that helps you prepare your taxes. They could have been like, oh yeah, we did that. We solved taxes. We're good. Yeah, we're good. Now, the one thing about that is they obviously need to update the product because the tax laws change each year. But they could just say, you know what, that's all we're doing. We're done. But that's not what they do. What they do is actually have these themes of, hey, we try to save people time on their taxes. We try to save people money on their taxes. And they're constantly trying to find new ways that they can save people time and money on their taxes. Those themes have not changed since TurboTax version 1 came out. Now, what can happen is as you nail those themes and you're a market leader and stuff, you occasionally discover, hey, there's a new theme we can add. But the time frame with which that happens is it's not like it's months that you're like, okay, we have a new theme now, right? There's so much work to be done, especially if you do take an MVP concept mindset. You're intentionally saying we're only going to go so far in this theme before we check and see how we're doing. So there's going to be plenty of work, additional work to be done in that theme. All you're doing is identifying what's the most important work in that theme to get going, right? So there's multiple products. If you think about what they do, they deepen their value proposition in the same themes over time. And yes, occasionally they will add an additional theme or they'll expand into an adjacent market opportunity or something like that. But that's kind of how I think about the themes.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think what that really underscores for me is that the themes are the customer problems and not a specific.
Yes. Yeah, they are, especially when you're doing a V1. Now, later on, when you're more mature, you'll start to see company OKRs creep in as themes like, okay, we need to increase conversion rate, or we need to do this. And those are legit themes too. Those are more likely
business problems.
Yeah, business, exactly. But if you focus only on business problems, then you have a big business problem because you want to make customers. But basically, yeah, those can change a little bit. But again, there's evergreen things there of conversion, retention, ARPU, like that, that you're probably the tactics will change quarter to quarter, but the fundamentals of growing your business and making it better over time won't change as much. So,
yeah, great. Thank you. This has been nice.
Okay, sure. You got it.
So let's say I have version 1 that's already been of the product that's already been released.
Yes.
And used by the customers, and then I want to I have a product roadmap of version 1.1 with all the feature set, but I want to make sure the feature sets add value to the customer. So would you have any recommendation of whether I should be using product survey to test if those features add value through the product?
So let's take it apart. There's 2 parts to your question.
Yeah.
The main question, which is an awesome question I love, is, hey, we're pretty dialed in on version 1. We've got some thoughts about what would be most valuable to incrementally add for version 1.1.
Yes.
How might we go about confirming and validating that the things we plan to build are actually going to be the most valuable for the customers? That's the main question.
That's correct.
The next thing you said is, hey, Dan, would you recommend using a survey to do that?
Yeah.
So the answer to the first question is yes, absolutely. You should validate that. The answer to the second question is I would not recommend a survey as the best methodology to do that, right?
Okay.
As I like to point out in some of my other, you can go look at some of my other talks about user research. Surveys are very easy to get wrong or get bad conclusions, right? And so I understand the temptation, which is, hey, we've got 10 features that we could build for version 1.1. Let's just send a survey to customers and list all 10 and have them kind of, score them. And then we'll use that data. Mm-hmm. That sounds reasonable. It sounds logical. The problem is, like, imagine for a second, I tell you all, hey, you know what? I'm working on a new app that makes it really easy to share photos with your friends, right? That's the app that I'm working on. And I'm wondering, how interested are you all in that app? Does that sound interesting? Would anybody, it's a free app. Would anybody want an app that makes it really easy to share photos with your friends? And a lot of people would probably raise their hand and say, I would, right? I guarantee what each person was just visualizing in their head for the product is nothing like what I plan to build. And each one has their own interpretation. So the problem with a survey is you're using a few words to try to convey what the product's going to be. And it's very subject to that person's interpretation and to them projecting their ideal version of the product in their head, right? So that's why the value of a prototype, picture's worth 1,000 words. If you want me to write a survey to get a certain feature approved, I can write it in a way to put bias in that will get that approved. Hey, you want that to get not approved? You want that feature to get killed? I can write the survey in a way that will bias it so it wouldn't. So that's why instead what I would do is I would do a prototype of the new features we plan to do for version 1.1 and get feedback. And that's a much higher fidelity, rigorous way to see what's going on, right? The only thing that potentially someone might say, yeah, Dan, but if you test the prototype, you're only going to test it with like 10 people. But if we survey, we could survey 1,000 and we can get a lot more statistical significance. I understand that point, but the problem is you're still going off a few words. The fundamental data you're getting a bigger data set on is just flawed. So I'd rather do it with prototype
data through the survey.
So when you're doing new features, qualitative is way more important. And I call this Oprah versus Spock. Oprah is the qualitative master. She sits down with people one-on-one. She really understands what makes them tick and their preferences. And Spock is Mr. Quantitative, like the data, the large sample sizes, statistics. And so I have other talks where I talk about that. And the reality is they're both valuable, but in different situations. And in general, when it's early in the product development cycle and you still haven't achieved product market fit and you're still like adding features and trying to find the right market and things like that, qualitative is much more valuable because you don't know what you don't know yet. And later, post-launch, when you have product market fit, now you can use more quantitative techniques like A/B testing, And surveys are more valuable at that point as well. But still, you got to use surveys for the right tool. That's why I always like to remind people, what's the most popular survey in our world? It's NPS, Net Promoter Score, right? Yes. That's the one that most people use. Maybe CSAT, customer sat, is second. But why is that? Well, if you think about Net Promoter Score, is one question. It's not a whole survey. It's one question. And they dictate the question to you. You have 1 degree of freedom. It's like an ad lib. You got to put in the name of your product. How likely would you be to recommend X to a friend or colleague? So you can't mess it up. You have no leeway to mess up the question. And then the answer responses are 0 to 10. You have no leeway. So it's like baby proof. Like it's a survey. It's like a baby proof survey. Nobody can mess it up because all you do is insert the name of your product, right? As opposed to when you try to do these more creative things and you're like, hey, let's get people to vote on ideas. That's where you kind of can go south. I was lucky at Intuit. I mentioned Intuit. We had a PhD in market research on our team. And so I learned from her best practices of when to use qual and when to use a survey and, how to write the survey questions and, what not to use surveys for. So far too often people will use surveys to try to get customer preferences of new feature ideas. And that's just not a good use case. I'd rather get customer feedback via survey on their problems. And in fact, you'll see I recommend like an importance versus satisfaction survey where it's really more about the problems and opportunities. And then you try to come up with your solutions and then you show them a prototype of your solutions to get feedback.
Okay, understood.
Yeah, great. You're welcome. Great question. Okay, well, thanks everybody for a great meetup. I appreciate it.